For football fans, just the mention of Liverpool's Kop end evokes an image of a packed stand full of fans. Many other football clubs also have a Kop stand too. But why do those stands have that name? In this episode, we'll be talking about the Battle of Spion Kop. Fought in South Africa in the dying years of the Victorian era, the battle was the bloodiest day for the British Army up until the First World War. The battle featured incredible heroism, command incompetence, and the presence of figures such as Winston Churchill and Mahatma Gandhi. Hello, my name is Gareth Edwards and welcome to the Untitled History Podcast. Join me each week alongside world-leading experts as we take a deep dive into your favourite topics from throughout history. From the ancient world to the modern, and with plenty of historical rabbit holes in between, we'll cover famous and not so famous moments in history from all across the globe. So let's look at the battle which, as one notable historian once described it, became the byword for a bloodbath. I am, as always, your host, Gareth Edwards, and with me today, I'm lucky to have that notable historian who said the bloodbath thing. It is my good friend Spence, better known as Dr. Spencer Jones. Say hello to everyone, Spence.
Hello, Gareth. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be joining you today, as always, and looking forward to talking about one of those battles that, at the time, absolutely one of the most famous or notorious incidents you can think of, but now perhaps better known for the football connection, which I'm sure we're going to get into.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for those unfamiliar, this you are of course Dr. Spencer Jones. You have a have a nice Indiana Jones-esque name. I've always liked it. Spencer is an award-winning historian and author. He is the senior lecturer in armed forces and war studies at the University of Wolverhampton, and serves as the regimental historian for the Royal Regiment of Artillery. He's also co-host of our sister podcast, World War I Not So Quiet on the Western Front. And I have a sneaking suspicion that in return for this, I absolutely owe you a Jutland episode, don't I?
Oh, absolutely. And listeners, if you're watching this with your video enabled, I am modelling some of the fine merchandise you can purchase for Not So Quiet on the Western Front.
Which I own one of those, I think. I think I've
should have coordinated.
Yeah, I should have coordinated. We will have merch in the store soon. I suspect it will feature a certain tortoiseshell cat, but we'll see. But yeah, I mean, is it maybe, Spence, it's worth, if you don't mind, just people will probably not be familiar with the Boer War, and it's not a thing unless you've really looked into it. It really sits in the cultural memory today. So would you mind maybe just setting the scene slightly for this period, what year we're in, and what the situation is that leads to this battle almost?
It would be my pleasure, Gareth, and you're absolutely right. This is one of those events that, when it's still within living memory, is huge. Right up until the 1960s and 70s, reports of the death of Boer War veterans make major newspapers in Britain and in South Africa. It's left that amount of legacy, but to put us in the time frame, because it's not so well known now, we're talking about Southern Africa, and specifically the country that will become South Africa. And this is late in the period. The Boer War will be between 1899 and 1902, so it's really the last years of the scramble for Africa, this 30-year period where European powers subdivide the continent under their various rules. Most of Africa now is under some form of European administration, but South Africa's an anomaly. It's the only part of Africa which has independent, white-dominated European settlement. And this is the Dutch republics of Transvaal and Orange Free State, which nestle in the northeastern part of what is modern South Africa now. And the story of these colonies is in itself quite fascinating, and it goes way back to the 1600s. When the Dutch first landed in South Africa in Cape Town, on the western side of South Africa, and founded Cape Town as a fort, as a reprovisioning port for trade that was heading to and from what was then the Dutch East Indies. And it was a pretty inhospitable billet, it has to be said. Didn't attract a huge amount of immigration from Europe. Inhospitable climate, long way from home. There were more attractive places for Dutch settlers to head. And so its population was never particularly big, and it was quite insular, and it led to some interesting developments. As early as the 1700s, the Dutch in South Africa described themselves not as Dutch, but as Afrikaners, Africans, or Boers, which means farmer, and two words used synonymously. And they were very independent. Their religion owed more to the 1600s than it did the 17 or 1800s. Their legal system was quite old-fashioned by comparison to European Netherlands, and even their language was becoming a little bit strange. Dutch settlers in the early part of the 1700s reported that it sounded amusing. It sounded sort of medieval Dutch. So you've got this very insular and quite unique white population in South Africa. And story might have ended there, but of course, the need to capture Cape Town in the Napoleonic Wars in 1806 by the British to stop French privateers raiding shipping going to and from India leads to the British effectively entering southern Africa way before the scramble as well. This is nearly 70 years before the Great Scramble for Africa. The British capture Cape Town, and then when the Napoleonic Wars end, they take full control of what is then the Cape, which is where the Boers live. And it's like inheriting a really difficult set of neighbours, because the Dutch, the Afrikaners, I should say, well, they didn't really like the Dutch government, but at least they shared some culture and some language with the Dutch government. They absolutely can't stand the British. No common language, no common legal system, even religion's a little bit different. And the British very quickly realise, well, we've got a problem here. So they do what often the British Empire does, ship in a load of really hardy Scottish settlers, beginning in the 1820s. If anybody can turn these difficult Dutch into good, honest British citizens, it can be the Scots. And this is the beginning of the English-speaking settlement of South Africa as well. And tensions rise between the Dutch and the what they call the Cape English, so British settlers, and it culminates in the 1830s when the banning of the slave trade, Gareth, that pushes the Dutch over the edge. They've had enough. They've been a slaveholding society since the 1600s. Their agricultural culture is based on slaves, not actually taken within southern Africa, but mainly from Madagascar and East Africa. Suddenly having the abolition of the slave trade in combination with all these tensions that have been brewing for decades, that's enough. And the Dutch actually undertake this remarkable migration, the Great Trek. About 20,000 Dutch from a population of maybe 40,000 head east, and they found these new countries, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. And in some ways there the story might have ended, but of course the scramble for Africa brings the British up close to these nations. There's a war, the First Boer War, in 1880, which very small scale fighting, but the Boers effectively win it. They win the decisive Battle of Majuba Hill, defeat a small British army in almost comical circumstances. You could do a podcast about Majuba called How Not to Fight a Battle.
It's absolutely on the list. I absolutely totally want to do it.
The fact that the main British general gets apparently shot in his bedroom slippers, I think captures something about that. And the British government says, well, we're not going to reinforce this campaign because these nations are poor. There's nothing there. They're absolutely hopeless. Why would we send a huge army at great expense to conquer them? Forget it. You can have your independence. And there, Gareth, well, the story might have ended, but as you and I both know, what happens in the mid-1880s? Well, these republics find out they're sitting on the biggest gold and diamond reserves in the world. And from that point, it's just a countdown to the British trying to annex them.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is the standard British Empire thing. If we're quite happy to leave you alone as long as you just have a scratty bit of farmland, the moment the diamonds are there, the moment the gold is there, everything changes. And that's the point where from now, the British are really pushing to see how do we seize control of this area. And that starts politically, doesn't it? Because there's almost an effort to continue that process of bringing in British citizens to try and effectively almost rig the vote and get those republics to almost vote to become part of the British Empire, which ultimately then leads to an attempt to overthrow the Boer government, the Jameson raid, which is another one we should do at some point. But by October 1899, the British are effectively massing troops in Natal. They're not officially at war, but it's very clear what the British government's intention is at this point, isn't it? And the Boers aren't stupid, so they respond.
That's right, and this pressure that's building on the Boer republics is anchored on this idea of immigration into the Boer republics, because the Golden Diamond Rush, it brings in huge numbers of immigrants from across the world looking to make it rich, and the Dutch call them Uitlanders, outsiders or outlanders, and they deny them the franchise. And the British government says, well, this is terrible, you've got to give these poor huddled masses the vote. At the same time, when only about 4 out of 10 British male citizens at home have the vote, portraying the Boers as this backwater of lack of democracy is a bit rich coming from Britain at the time. And furthermore, the Uitlanders, such as they are quite happy living under the Dutch. A lot of them come from countries where there's no franchise. There's a huge number of Poles, for example, where there's no franchise in Russian Poland at all. So they don't really care about having the vote. They just want to live there and make some money best they can. So the British political pressure is sort of running out of steam. And so this military pressure appears instead. And it's quite obvious that this is a precursor to some sort of military campaign on probably spurious grounds. As you say, the Boers aren't stupid. They read the runes. They understand this. And their decision is, well, if we wait much longer, the British will have a humongous army. We'll never stop them. So instead, we will go to war. We'll try and win some battles, as we did at Majuba Hill in the 1880s, get a political settlement and finish up. And perversely, the British want that as well, because they can say, well, the Boers declared war on us. They started it, even though it's clearly British provocation at this stage. So all this, the scene's set by October 1899. The Boers mobilise, declare war to try and strike the British before even more troops arrive in country.
So, and people probably have a reasonably good vision of what the British Army is like in 1900. You're coming to the end of that red coat era. You're coming to the beginning of the era where people are using rifles rather than muskets. We're hitting the period where artillery is getting more complex, but also smaller and more maneuverable in many ways as well. So it's this weird sort of transition point, pre-World War I, but end of sort of the Victorian era. But it's a very standard army, the British Army. It's not really the case for the Boers, is it?
No, it's not. They're absolutely unique. In fact, British attempts to study the Boers flounder on the fact that the Boers are such an unusual army, because on one hand they are European, although the Boers wouldn't describe themselves as European, they are Afrikaans. But on the other hand, it's not a professional army. The Boer army is a militia force that's called out in times of emergency. The only professional part of the army is the artillery, the state artillery, which has a handful of very modern guns, mainly French, some German as well. And state artillery officers actually get trained in France, in French artillery schools, then come back and teach this very small professional branch. But the rest of the armies are citizens. And when the Boer government puts out the call, you muster based on your region, you elect your own officers, and you turn up for war wearing the clothes you've got on your back, carrying your own gun, which I'm sure we'll get onto in a moment, and if possible, bringing your own horse. If you don't have a gun, or your gun's out of date, the government will give you a Mauser rifle, which it has imported from Germany. If you don't have a horse, the government will give you a horse as well. But otherwise, this isn't trained soldiery. This is sort of tough frontiersmen who arrive with this tremendous outdoor culture and this tremendous gun culture. And although there are urban Boers, there's plenty of those living in places like Pretoria, Bloemfontein, and so on, the vast majority of Boers are rural. They come from a frontier society, a very tough society, and there's this really unique gun culture where the gun is a symbol of masculinity. It's a means of independence. And traditionally in Boer families at this time, when you're 12 as a boy, you're given your first gun. It's usually a small caliber gun, a squirreling rifle. And when you're 14, you're effectively an adult, and so you're given your first proper gun, a rifle you can hunt with and, if necessary, defend your homestead with as well. And when the Boers mobilise their citizenry, everybody from the ages of 16 to 60 who's able-bodied is expected to turn up with your own gun. And because of this gun culture, most of these people do have a gun. Not all of them are modern, but they can be replaced with modern Mausers as well. And so you've got this very tough raw material that, although it might not have formal training, what it lacks in formal training, it makes up for. And these are rugged people who have tough lives in the outdoors. And they're a pretty handy crowd, it has to be said.
And it's not just them that are tough. It's one thing I always find fascinating is their horses that are tough too. They are like, we don't really have time to talk about it a lot, but their horses are much better at surviving in that atmosphere and the environment of the South African region at this time. They can eat the native grasses. They can survive on it in a way that the actual British really, really struggle with their own horses. And that even just little differences like that are huge. And it's worth remembering this, that in modern terms, we talk about force multipliers. So we talk about the idea that for armies to succeed when they're smaller, and the Boer army is smaller, vastly smaller than the British army, they need differentials that can counteract that difference in material. And the Boers are well trained, they're well equipped for the environment they're fighting in, they know the land, they know how to use it, and they are absolutely capable of giving the British the run for their money, aren't they?
Absolutely they are. These are tough, rugged people. I'm glad you mentioned the horses, which the British class as ponies, and these are descendants of the original horses the Dutch brought out in the 1600s. They've been bred for generations to thrive in the South African environment. They can eat the very rich grass that you find in the veldlands. and live off it. Whereas British horses coming from Europe absolutely cannot. They are not used to this. They won't eat it. They can't eat it. And so what it means is that all the Boers are effectively mounted riflemen. Everybody has a horse, or a pony if you prefer. Everybody's got a gun. Large numbers of these people know how to use both. They're used to riding, they're used to outdoors living, and they're used to shooting, because this is a tough time in South Africa. Banditry out on the frontier is widespread, especially cattle rustling, and most Boers will hunt as well, because it's a great way to supplement your diet. So these people know how to shoot, they know how to ride, and they're very tough. They're very tough. Bringing them all together, and I think this speaks to its toughness. A Boer unit, when it forms, and they're all formed based on a district, it's called a commando. And in Afrikaans, that doesn't have any great implication. It's just the name for a Boer unit. But of course, Gareth, in British language, it's got huge implications as special forces, and that comes directly from Winston Churchill,
who of course is present, and he's one of the characters who's going to show up as we go through this. I mean, he is front and center in it to me. I always, as always with Winston Churchill, I caution people to remember that Winston Churchill is never quite as front and center as he claims in his own writings, but he is genuinely here, and that's a real impact on what will happen later. But I mean, it's probably worth us then. We've set the scene nicely. I think the opening moves of the war when they kick off really, again, initially seem to follow the same lines that first Boer War did. The Boers are very successful. They catch the British off guard in terms of how successful they are, just using the tactics and the manoeuvring they do. And that leads them to do things like they manage to besiege Mafeking, which, if you are in any way linked to the scouting movement, you will recognize that name. It is, of course, where Baden-Powell's story starts. But their real goal here is to logistically cripple and beat the British, because, as you say, their goal here is not to occupy territory. It's effectively to defeat the British and make it more costly for the British to continue fighting the war than it is to just give up and reach a political settlement. And that ultimately leads them to push towards Ladysmith, doesn't it?
It does. So the Boers burst across their borders, and they go for Mafeking because that's where the Jameson raiders come from. And it's got this sort of cultural impact to the Boers. It's also a route, if anything is coming from Bechuanaland, any British assault, it's going to have to pass through Mafeking. So if you can take Mafeking out, that secures the Boer western flank. They plunge down onto Kimberley, the diamond mining town. But as you say, Gareth, the real target is Ladysmith, which is otherwise a pretty unremarkable town. It's a pretty tough mining town nowadays. But it's important in 1899 because that's where the main British army in South Africa is based. And if the Boers can eliminate that or defeat it in a pitched battle, that might lead to a Majuba moment. The British go, oh, you've got us, can't afford to continue this war. And they make a deal. And they get close to it because although the fighting in October doesn't all go the Boers' way, there are some pretty bloody setbacks and some battles. What does happen is the Boers just advance and advance and advance on Ladysmith until eventually they're able to encircle it. British attempt to defeat the Boers at the Battle of Ladysmith at the end of October. It's a total shambles, gets known as Mournful Monday. Everything goes wrong. British are driven back into Ladysmith and they get encircled. And you've got about 12,000 British soldiers, which is the bulk of the British fighting army in South Africa, are now trapped in Ladysmith. And if they're forced to surrender, it's the biggest surrender of British troops since the Napoleonic Wars. And it will have huge political impact. The Boers think if we could win from defeating a small British force at Majuba, we're definitely going to win if we force 12,000 British soldiers to lay down their arms. What that certainly would do is it would collapse the government in Britain, and who knows what might have happened. So the Boers aren't wrong to actually say this is the key. If we force them to surrender, starve them out, we're going to win. And for a few months, really October, November into December, it looks like they might do it.
And the world is watching. I mean, none of this happens in isolation. Britain has rivals in Europe and beyond, and those rivals are watching, and the Boers know this. And part of this is trying to make it so that other European powers will intervene and lead to political pressure on Britain to reach a settlement. I mean, I love that, we've got evidence, we've got letters and communications that show that the German Kaiser is chatting to the Russians and the French and saying, you know what, if we work together, we can force the British to come to the table here. It's a humiliation for the British. But the British have one thing going for them, really, in terms of what's the balance of power. And that's the lurking and imminent presence of something called the Natal Field Force, isn't it?
It is, because as soon as the Boer War breaks out, the British dispatch a pretty large force. 48,000 men go out from Britain to what is initially planned. They're going to be a spearhead to invade the Boer republics. They're going to operate as one single army. And a word on numbers here, 48,000 British troops arriving, in theory joining about 12,000 operating around Natal, so 50,000 men. At its height, the Boer army is about 35,000, and it does vary a lot. And probably in terms of effectives, you can probably reduce that to somewhere between 25 and 30,000. So the British are potentially going to outnumber the Boers 2-1. But various things go wrong, because originally the field force is meant to be one single army, a big battering ram that's going to march right into Boer territory. But because the Boers have had the initiative, and they're besieging Mafeking, Kimberley, and crucially Ladysmith, the commander of this force has to split his army into three. He sends one part to try and relieve Kimberley, another part stays in what's called the Cape Midland area to try and secure rail there, and he's going to lead the key component, which is the Natal Field Force itself, which is about 20,000 men. And this is a great hero of the Empire, General Reivers Buller VC. And this guy, Gareth, he really is a hero from an earlier age who's goes forward in South Africa. He wins the Victoria Cross in the Zulu War in 1879. And he's a seriously tough character. In his youth, he's this absolute bull of a man, built like an ox, strong, fearless. But age is starting to catch up with him a little bit.
Yeah, I think that I find Reivers Buller fascinating because, as you say, he's almost that kind of Flashman-esque icon in his youth. He's an incredible figure, huge guy, but he's the first one to admit that by the time he's taking command of this force, he's past his prime. He knows he's past his prime. He self-describes that his muscle is now more fat than muscle, and he actually effectively does his best almost to turn down command to begin with. Because he knows the Boers, he knows how tough they are, and he's reasonably convinced they're a far, far harder fight than the British expect, as the Boers have now demonstrated. He's also perhaps best described as not a particularly subtle man, is he?
Absolutely not. And I'm glad you made that point that he knows the Boers, because in 1879, he'd fought alongside Boer volunteers who were serving alongside the British, and he knows these men. The point that he really wants to avoid the posting, he shows self-awareness. He knows that his time has passed, really, and perhaps he might well be promoted beyond his ability. He's a man of action. All his success has been leading from the front. Is he an administrator? Is he a general? Perhaps not. The one thing he has is he's incredibly loved by his soldiers. He has the common touch, even though he's from an aristocratic background, from Devon. He knows how to speak to common soldiers, and they love him for it. He doesn't really want to go, and he expresses strong opinions about the campaigns already being botched, but he's pressured, and he has to do his duty, and so he goes out, and he's the one who's going to lead the Natal Field Force, the NFF, directly towards Ladysmith. And he's got lots of problems. The fact that all the British cavalry, or virtually all the British cavalry in South Africa, gets locked in Ladysmith isn't helpful, because it means he's only got a very, very small mounted force, so difficult for him to scout. He's stuck following the rail lines, needs supplies. He can't break loose into the open country, which is very rugged. And the Boers, of course, know he's coming, so they've prepared all kinds of defences in front of him. So he initially tries to batter his way straight down the throat from the south to the north, try and break through at a place called Colenso, with some crossings over the Tugela River. It's a total disaster, and a clue really about what's going to come, because this is, in some ways, this battle encapsulates the early Boer War, where one British journalist described the early battles of the Boer War, and he was there. He said, it's nothing but an honest, straightforward march into a row of waiting rifles. And that's basically what happens at Colenso.
And I find that fascinating, because it's almost the British are almost eating something that they have inflicted on others in the past. You can almost reverse that situation, and it's sort of a bit of a description of Waterloo. You've got Wellington saying, "My God, the man is a pounder," about Napoleon, about he's just driving straight down the middle. Yeah, here this is the tactical flexibility isn't there on the side of the British, and that is what this campaign repeatedly is an attempt to just hammer through the Boer forces, the Boer lines, and they're just it's such a tough thing to do. But we get more soldiers sent out now, and this is one of those nascent points, is why I find it fascinating, where you start to get the emergence of sort of Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand presence within the forces and within their kind of national memory. Something that will really come together in World War One when we start to get to things like Vimy Ridge and we get to Gallipoli. But I mean, I was out in Toronto at the end of last year and I was visiting the various sort of regimental museums there. I love a regimental museum. If you go to, say, the regimental museums in Toronto, and there's several good ones, their story starts often with the Boer War because they're now heading out. And they're also heading out here as part of effectively a new division that's being sent out to join Buller, which is under the command of Major General Charles Warren. Now, Warren's interesting, isn't he?
Oh, you could say that. And Charles Warren, what can we say about Major General Charles Warren? Well, first of all, we could say he's slightly unusual. He's a Royal Engineer. So he's come up through the technical branch. And in fact, he's been a very successful archaeologist in the Middle East prior to this. Known, in fact, for uncovering various things during that great craze for searching for lost civilizations across what was then the Ottoman Empire. But perhaps he's most famous for being the chief of the Met Police during the hunt for Jack the Ripper and failing, of course, to catch Jack the Ripper, which he'd earned absolutely significant criticism for. And he's probably most famous for that outside the realms of military history. What strikes me, Gareth, is Charles Warren is an odd man. He's noted as being odd during his archaeological days. He dresses strange. He behaves strangely. He has some really strange ideas. So one of his ideas is he thinks it's a good idea for generals to take their baths in front of their soldiers. He never really explains why he thinks this is a good idea, but he's keen on the idea. And
I'm pretty certain, actually, that there's something that Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus writes about that. Back in, always described as doing a similar thing. So I do wonder if that's part of his archaeology thing. Maybe he's pulling it from classical literature and the idea that this is what the great Roman generals did.
Wouldn't surprise me. And he probably saw himself in the same ranks as those great generals because he definitely has a very high opinion of himself, to say the least. And by the time he arrives and the British campaign has gone off the rails completely in December. Not only has Buller been defeated, but his two other forces, the one in the Cape Midlands and the one driving on Kimberley, they've both been defeated. And the Times newspaper, which is the newspaper of record in 1899, calls it the Black Week of the British Army. And so there's already doubts in Britain about, well, Buller might not be up to the job. And so they send out Charles Warren with a letter in his pocket saying that if Buller is killed, wounded, or otherwise disabled, then he gets to take over. Now, that's fine, but the moment Warren arrives and he's had his a little bit of preliminaries with Buller, he pulls out this letter and basically says, I'm here to replace you if you get taken out. And Buller sees this sort of for what it is. This is basically saying we don't have much faith in you because it doesn't just say if Buller's killed or wounded. It also sort of implies if he's considered unfit to command, which is a little bit nebulous. What does it mean? And Buller is really annoyed about this. And he and Warren immediately fail to get on. And Buller is, for all his flaws, he is a sort of man of action, obviously past his prime, who understands the army and has a sort of love of the army. Whereas Warren is this slightly strange character who's worn lots and lots of different hats and might fancy himself as a great general. But as we'll see, doesn't really cover himself in glory. So it's not a great start. And something that comes out of Buller's mind here is, Buller's frustrated, he's not enjoying it, he knows he shouldn't really be in command here, and he sort of says to Warren almost, well, you do it. You work it out. If you're my replacement, you plan the next campaign. And that's going to lead us, Gareth, to eventually to Spion Kop.
Yeah, and we're kind of hitting that point now, I think, really. I mean, to set the scene for people, as you say, Warren is now almost effectively not in charge, but Buller is very much in the, I will give you exactly as much rope as you need to hang yourself. And that's not really what you want at the top of your force command structure. But what this effectively leads to is Warren's very keen not to try the Colenso thing again. He looks through the terrain, he looks through what's available, and he lands on this idea of pushing through the hills and rugged terrain to the west, where they're thinnest, almost kind of trying to loop round a bit. Because if you can get through those hills, you can get through to the plains behind. And once you're onto those plains, you have a clean run at Ladysmith. And it's not a terrible idea, is it? It's really just the execution where it sort of falls down.
Yep, you're absolutely right. The tragedy is this is a good idea. Swing west. It's rugged terrain there, but if you can get over the ridgeline there, and it's a big ridgeline, we're not talking a handful of ridges. We're talking seriously rugged country here. But if you can do that, and you can capture that ridgeline, then you completely overlook basically a flat plain and the main road to Ladysmith. The Boers don't have anywhere to defend. If you can capture those ridges, put your British artillery there, the Boers are going to have to fall back a long way. It's going to reap results. So it's a good plan. Unfortunately, as is often the way with British military disasters, it's just executed really badly. It's very slow. It's very slow movement. The British army is not rapid in the way the Boers are. Remember, the Boers are all mounted. And then on top of that, you've got bad luck. There's terrible summer thunderstorms. Of course, January is the South African summer, and I've experienced some of those thunderstorms, and they are absolutely devastating. If you've not been in them, wow, they're something else. And so that turns all the roads to mud. It makes movement very difficult. And the army limps west rather than this rapid hook around the Boer flank. Instead, it's a lumbering move. It averages about 2 miles an hour, which is pitifully slow. And the Boers can see the army moving. They're all mounted. They're much more mobile. So they just swing across to block the British in that rugged ground as well. And there are opportunities to get through that flank. Particularly Lord Dundonald, who's commanding a mixed cavalry and mounted infantry force. He finds a gap, and there's a chance to get through really quickly, but Warren, he doesn't like that. That's not part of his plan, and Dundonald's gone charging off doing his own thing, so Warren doesn't reinforce him. Dundonald doesn't exploit that gap. Opportunity goes begging. And by the 20th of January, the British are in position around these ridge lines, but the Boers are on them, and there's a fair amount of skirmishing for the next 4 days. It's clear the Boers are all over these positions. And what Warren really wants, Gareth, is, well, we won't attack the entire ridge lines because that's going to be very bloody. Where's the key? What will unlock this entire chain of ridges? And he thinks he finds it in Spion Kop, which is this, from the ground, from the British side, appears to be the biggest, most dominating hill of all the ridges. But it's not a bad plan from Warren's perspective. It looks from his line, this one overlooks all the other hills. So if we can capture this, we can overlook the other Boer ridge lines and we can blast them off these. But from the Boer side, it looks a bit different.
Yeah, I do think it's one of those examples of where perspective matters, and quite literally in this instance, because from where Warren has his HQ, as you say, this looks like a dominant position on the map. You take Spion Kop, you are overlooking the other hills, you can force the Boers off of it, you can force them off. The reality, though, is that it doesn't really dominate the hills in the way Warren thought. There's actually relatively little height difference between Spion Kop and the hills around it. And so the other flaw being that ultimately, if your plan is that you can get somewhere and you can inflict effectively what's called enfilade fire on the hills around you, if that difference in height isn't what you think it is, that situation works in reverse as well. If you can fire on them, they can fire on you. And doesn't really have a way of knowing this from the ground. He also doesn't necessarily have a way of knowing that the route to that top is far easier from the Boer side of the engagement than it is from the British side. I mean, this is a huge thing. This is about 1,400 feet up. It's not small. And it's not a thing you can just run up the side of, is it? I mean, you have quite literally climbed it. You describe it.
I have, and I climbed it a long time ago, listeners, when I was younger, fitter, very active at the time, and I climbed it with a very light kit, some hiking boots, some nice practical summer South African wear, and water and a few snacks. I wasn't climbing it with rifle and pack in the dark, and it is a tough climb. Coming from the British side, it's a tough climb. You can't simply go directly up it. There's no direct path up this. It's too steep for that, so you have to meander left and right, up and down. Even meandering up and that way, there's times when you're almost having to scramble a little bit on your hands and your knees to just get over certain ridge lines. It's a really tough climb, and by the time I'd done it, and this is under no military pressure at all, and I was very fit at the time, I was pretty gasping by the time I reached there. This is not an easy climb, even when you're doing it for pleasure. Trying to do it under cover of darkness with all your kit and also trying to keep quiet, that's a really brutal climb. And the fact that it's such a tough climb up is also going to have problems for Warren's long-term plan, because even if his surprise attack captures Spion Kop, it's not easy to then reinforce Spion Kop or get messages back down from Spion Kop. You've got to go up this really rugged track, really brutal track. As I say, when I did it, and I'm going back a long time now, my memory is it took between 45 minutes and an hour. And that was in completely light kit, knowing where I was, with a guide who could say, go this way, go that way. If you don't know the ground, and it's also bakingly hot and you're wearing your wool serge uniforms. Wow, that is tough. You're looking under combat conditions probably for quickest about 2 hours to get from the bottom of Spion Kop to the top. And if you're trying to bring things, supplies, or move a unit up, it's going to take longer because people are going to get strung out and things. So it's not an easily reinforceable position at all.
And that's the plan, really, isn't it? Warren's plan is, let's take this under the cover of darkness. Let's hold it while guns are brought up and use those guns to force everyone else off the other hills. And that's really the grand plan. Again, it's not a terrible plan on paper, but for all the reasons we've just described, the climb, the terrain, the lack of elevation that seems there from the ground, this is all going to turn out to be far harder than anyone thought it would be. And now the attack the attack proper starts on the 23rd of January. And it takes 4 hours for the British to even just reach the edge of the plateau. And that's moving as silently as possible. They're doing this at night. They're doing this in heavy fog. I think this is another thing that people don't really think about the kind of the South African sort of conditions at this time in this place. Is all of this is happening in a heavy fog as well. And the Boers do have a small force on top, but they've mostly abandoned it for the very reason that it's going to turn out to be a bad position for the British, which is they don't think it's a good position to hold. But they have built some rudimentary sort of fortifications or rudimentary trench works on there, haven't they? And this really confuses the British once they get on the top.
It does. So I'm glad you mentioned the fog, because this is so important. You've got very hot summer days, and then it goes cold at night, much colder, especially in the hills, which creates fog. And so the British march up Spion Kop slowly under cover of darkness. They're going to burst on with a bayonet assault and overwhelm the Boers, which they do. They do actually successfully. The Boers are caught by surprise by this. This is the most successful part of probably the entire British attack. They burst out of the fog, shouting "Majuba, Majuba," which is a British battle cry referencing that earlier battle. And one unlucky Boer sentry gets bayoneted. He's commemorated up there now as an unknown casualty, and incredibly, he couldn't be identified. Probably, we think, a Polish immigrant, one of the Uitlanders that supposedly the British were fighting to free and give the franchise. A Polish immigrant who might not have known his comrades that well, perhaps they didn't know his name, but he's when you go to Spion Kop, there is this little plaque there commemorating this unknown Boer who's probably Polish. He gets killed. The rest of the Boers scarper. They disappear into the fog. And then the British go, right, brilliant, we've captured this. And the plan is to entrench themselves here under cover of darkness. And then in the morning, the Royal Artillery will manhandle some guns up there. That's going to be pretty questionable, but that's the plan. Emplace them, and the British will overlook the Boers and blast them off the ridges. But as you say, Gareth, those trenches the Boers have been digging, these gun positions, that throws the British, because in the fog, they don't really have a sense of the top of Spion Kop, which is this plateau, big flat plateau. And the British find these trenches and go, oh, that looks about right. And they start digging in along it. Digging in is perhaps it's doing too much, because the ground's really hard and stony. The troops are really tired. They've been marching for hours. They've come up this great big ridge. They're tired. And there's getting a lot of work done is difficult. The trench is basically built along the old Boer earthworks. It's big straight line. That's going to be a problem. One of the big lessons is you don't build trenches in big straight lines. They get enfiladed from both sides. But the British don't know this. They're exhausted. They just see this. They go, this looks good. Let's dig in. And it's not very deep. We're talking really sort of almost foxhole depth with just a little scrape of earth in front. And they occupy this trench and go, this is good. And then, of course, Gareth, in the morning, the fog starts to lift, and that's when both sides suddenly realise, hold on a moment, including the Boers, of course.
Yeah, and listeners, one thing I want you to kind of visualise here is what this plateau is like. So the British are not holding the nearest edge of the ridge that faces onto the Boer forces down on the plain below. They're almost back from that. They're holding a position back from that. And to stop the Boers coming up against them, they will need to move forward and leave almost their own minimal trench line that they've got and engage them on the furthest edge forward. But doing that is going to expose them to fire from those Boer forces if they start coming back up that hill, which, remember, is an easier climb from their side than it is from the British side. So I want you, as we talk about what actually happens here, I just want you to hold in your mind the visions that almost the British front line here is almost back from the edge. And they can push forward to the edge, but pushing forward to the edge is almost going to be as hard in casualty terms every time they do it on the British as it is the Boers coming up the hill towards them. So just try and remember that in your mind as we start talking about what happens next. Now, the key thing that happens next is really that the Boers have a better commander, arguably, on the ground than the British do, and he reacts very fast, doesn't he? Do you want to tell us a bit about him?
Absolutely. So this is Louis Botha, who is just in his 30s at the time. Not a military man. He's a Boer commando just like the rest, but he's fiercely intelligent. And of course, he's going to go on to have a spectacular military and political career in South Africa. And he's in charge of the troops on the ground. He's the one who's charged with defending the Tegela line, stop the British getting through to Ladysmith. And he immediately perceives that the fact the British are on Spion Kop is a problem. And if they are able to place guns there, it's going to be a problem. He's going to blow off his forces from the ridges around them. So he quickly rallies people. And there's actually a bit of panic in the Boer position because they're saying, oh, the British are on top. They forced us off. Some people are starting to mount up and retreat. Oh, all is lost. He rides through the camp yelling at people, threatening people if necessary, rallying people, and he rallies enough commandos and says, get back on top of Spion Kop, push the British off. And this point you keep making, Gareth, really important, whereas on the British side, it's this grueling multi-hour climb to the top. On the Boer side, it's steep, but it's much more climbable. You can go up it in a fraction of the time. And crucially, this is the other important thing you've made, the British can't really see the Boers coming up the slope unless they push right to the edge of Spion Kop itself, and there's very little cover there. There's some rocks, but there's not much. So the British feel much safer in their trench, but that means the Boers can swarm up the side of Spion Kop and get to the edge of it, start shooting into the British trench there. And so Botha manages to rally enough people, get them up. He's got guns on various positions on other ridges, sends messages to them, get all your guns onto Spion Kop, sends them additional ammunition, because he knows if the British hold on to Spion Kop, they can unlock his position. But on the other hand, he also knows Spion Kop isn't the perfect position the British think it is. It might become a killing ground. He can concentrate fire on it from multiple directions and keep the British pinned there with his infantry assault as well. If he can win this, he can drive the British back. If he doesn't, it is going to unhinge his line. So there's everything to play for.
And for the next few hours, this is really how it plays out. You've got that back and forth. The British several times try and push forward to the ridgeline. They try and force the Boers back. They're sometimes mildly successful, but each time they're themselves then forced back by this gunfire coming in from the other hills, the carnage that's wreaking on the British forces, and just because standing on that ridge front is a good way of getting shot. So you get this stalemate's perhaps the wrong word, because stalemate implies that no one's moving. You kind of think that everyone's just in their trenches doing things. You get almost this ebb and flow as the Boers try and force the British off, the British try and force the Boers off. But throughout all of this, the casualties are really racking up, and those casualties are disproportionate. And I think that's something that is worth mentioning here. I mean, I know there's a Boer soldier that both of us have a lot of affection for, and there's a great quote and a great account he gives of this battle, isn't there?
There is, and this is Dennis Reitz, who writes a fantastic book simply called Commando. And Dennis Reitz is an 18-year-old commando in 1899-1900. He's fighting at the Battle of Spion Kop, and he's passionately anti-British and passionately pro-Afrikaans. He'll fight through the entire war, and when the war ends, he's so disgusted by what's happened, the defeat of the Boers, he moves to Madagascar because he says, I cannot live under British rule. And yet, by 1918, he's a lieutenant colonel in the British Army on the Western Front, commanding a Scottish battalion. So he has an incredible journey. He writes about that in another book called Trekking On, which nobody's read in the way that Commando is read. But Commando is a fantastic book from a Boer eye view. And the quote is actually taken from Commando. And he's there. He's in that Boer position at the edge of Spion Kop, blasting away at the British in their trench. And he remembered, we were sustaining heavy casualties from the English scans immediately in front of us. And the men grew restive under the galling point-blank fire, a thing not to be wondered at, for the moral effect of Lee Metford volleys at 20 yards must be experienced to be appreciated. The English troops lay so near that one could have tossed a biscuit among them, and whilst the losses they were causing us were only too evident, we on our side did not know that we were inflicting even greater damage on them. Our own casualties lay hideously among us, but theirs were screened from view behind the breastwork. So it's interesting that Dennis Reitz and his comrades think, we're not winning this fight. the British are just blasting us down with volleys, and they are firing volleys out of this trench. But what, of course, they don't know, and Reitz makes this clear, is the British are taking a frightful pounding, not only from this close-range rifle fire, 20 yards, brutally close range, but also all this artillery that's pounding the plateau as well.
And to give people almost a counter-British view on that, I mean, this is I'll read out a quote that's from the British perspective on this, from a British soldier that's on that top there. And as he describes it, the shells were falling on the hills from both sides, as I counted at a rate of about 7 a minute. And the strange discharges of the Maxim shell guns, the pom-poms, as these terrible weapons are called for want of a correct name, lacerated the hillside with dotted chains of smoke and dust. The dead and injured smashed and broken by the shells littered the summit. It was a bloody, reeking shambles. And we should maybe actually mention the pom-poms, really, because this is the first appearance of what the pom-pom gun, and it's going to go on to have quite a storied career, isn't it?
It is, and these are Vickers Maxim pom-poms. They're 1-pounder auto cannons. The British have tried them out. They've actually tested them, didn't like them, so not impressed with these. The Royal Navy has a few for close-range work, but the army doesn't have them. But the Boers buy a number of them, and because they'll become so famous in the Second World War with their distinctive sound as anti-aircraft weapons, they have this very distinctive report, the pom-pom report. They also fire fast. And being under fire from one of these, this constant pom, 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 these shells aren't in themselves huge. They're not like a big 75mm shell that might burst over your head, shower shrapnel. But you get hit with one of these, the injuries are catastrophic. You're going to die, and you're going to die very badly. And being shot with these that are coming in from the flank as well is absolutely horrible. Combined with the sound, these pom-pom guns are raking along the British trench. Bigger guns are firing shrapnel over it. And it's no surprise, Gareth, that by about midday, between midday and 1 p.m, so bear in mind, listeners, the fighting has now been going on for between 6 or 7 hours, the British position begins to crumble. It begins to crumble on the right flank because that's where a lot of enfilade fire is coming from. And British troops there who are just taking such a pounding, casualties mounting, all the officers down, all the NCOs down. Something starts to happen. The flank starts to collapse. White flags start to appear. Perhaps it's disputed. And some of the Boers start to approach because they think the position is about to collapse and they're ready to take all the British prisoner. And then one of the great characters of this battle makes his surprise entrance.
This is, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Thornycroft, who's an absolute huge man by all accounts. He's just genuinely huge. And he's effectively commander on top of Spion Kop now, just because of the sheer casualties that have been inflicted on the officer side of the British at the top of that position. And yeah, I always loved this. This is a moment that really is one of those iconic, heroic moments of this, because he effectively spots or is informed this is happening. And he effectively runs almost across the entirety of this battlefield and single-handedly almost stops this himself. As he's written down, he shouts to the Boers who are starting to drag British prisoners away and out of these trenches on the side. He says, "You may go to hell. I command on this line and I allow no surrender. You must leave." And then effectively, arguably by beating them back and sheer surprise, the Boers are forced back out of this. But it comes at a cost. He picks up a rather nasty leg injury as part of this, doesn't he? And he's already exhausted. He's already struggling to maintain control up there. But this leg injury is going to aggravate him and get worse and worse and worse as the battle continues.
It is, and he is a huge man, as you say, perhaps about 6'5", 6'6", so big man, and with the weight to match as well. And although he's not fat, this is muscle and power. He's probably somewhere in the region of about 18 or 19 stone, and that's not including his kit. And he injures his knee badly during this moment. He's not shot, he just falls heavily, very severe injuries, limping very badly for the rest, and it hurts bad. We might speculate he's badly injured his ligaments somehow here, but he can't go anywhere. He's still in charge, and he knows that this position is pretty dire, really. He tries several times to take back the crest, drive the Boers back, but can't hold on to it. And even that 20 yards from the trench to the crest line, the Boers are just pounding that crest line. So all Thornycroft can do is just hold on, but it's difficult to hold on when you're being hit from every angle. And crucially, he can't easily get messages back down to Warren, down on the ground, because his communications devices, heliographs, which signal by the sun, they've all been smashed early in the action by incoming fire. So he can only really communicate, perhaps a little bit by flags, although that's really difficult. or he can send runners up and down. As we've already established, it's about 2 hours from Summit down to the bottom, and then a bit further to Warren's HQ. So communication's really strained. And what I think is particularly bad at this moment, you've got Thornycroft and his men fighting desperately to hold on here. And down on the ground, Gareth, you've got Warren, who is, we've already established, a strange character, and Buller sort of carrying out their own mini feud. And neither of them really taking charge of this situation.
Yeah, and I think you summed up that this fighting's been going on for hours and hours and hours. And so, listeners, you might be right to think, what the hell is happening at the bottom of this hill? Because this isn't the entirety of the British force that's up on Spion Kop. You couldn't fit the entirety of the force there. That this is a battle that should have wider things happening. But the problem, as Spence says, is that these are commanders that do not get on. And to a certain extent, what you see, particularly during the early phases of this battle, is Buller doing that. Okay, this is your plan, Warren. You go do something with it. I'm not going to bring my forces to help you. You started this, you finish it. And to focus almost on Warren first, before we look at what Buller and Buller's men do, Warren himself is just struggling because he does not have the information he needs to act. Can't get that information. He tries to send up runners. He tries to get information that's what's going on, but he's just not getting a clear picture. I mean, at one point, he actually tells his own artillery to stop firing. And they're actually doing a relatively good job of suppressing Boer fire from the surrounding hills. But all Warren can see from the ground is he can see the explosions happening. And he mistakenly believes that it's his own artillery that are accidentally bombarding Spion Kop. It's not, it's the Boers. But for a long time, he tells his own guns to cease firing, which means on the top of that hill, they suddenly lose fire support and they come under even more fire. But whilst he's doing that and being indecisive about what he does, what you'd really want in this situation is someone else to act. And that, in theory, should be Buller. And Buller does have forces that are doing things and maneuvering, doesn't he? But they don't do what they should do.
No, this is, again, one of the tragic moments where the battle might turn. The British might snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, because Neville Littleton's brigade goes over, and Littleton, who'll be the first chief of the general staff, later after the war, he goes over with his brigade, initially as reinforcements to assist Warren, but Littleton's a pretty effective brigadier. He ascertains, well, the Boers to the east of Spion Kop, they're all focused on fighting at Spion Kop. I think I can storm that ridge and relieve the pressure. And he starts making this attack. His battalion's moving up. A lot of hill fighting veterans from the northwest frontier of India and Pakistan, of course now Pakistan and Afghanistan. They're going up. They're fighting their way through. They're actually starting to drive the Boers back, and the Boers start to go, this is a problem, we're getting outflanked. But from his command post on the south side of the river, Buller sees this attack going in, sees the guys going up in extended order, skirmishing from rock to rock, and he's furious because he hasn't ordered that attack. And he actually sends over 3 separate messages saying, stop that right now. And the first 2 arrive in the chief of the staff of the brigade, a man called Henry Wilson, who will also go on to be chief of the Imperial General Staff and later get assassinated by the IRA in the 1920s. He gets the first 2 letters, or orders, and he just puts them in his pocket and pretends that he hasn't heard them. But by the time a third one arrives, he has to share it with Littleton. And Littleton says, well, I've got to follow this order. So he pulls off his units back down the slope at about 4:30 and ends a really promising attack. And that means the Boers just go back there, reoccupy their positions, and they start shooting at Spion Kop again and start outflanking it again. And so there's a chance of snatching this victory from the jaws of defeat, and it's lost because Buller is so insistent, well, you can't do anything I haven't told you, even if it's working. So what a disaster. So it all falls back onto Warren, and Warren doesn't really have a clue what's going on the summit. He's been getting vague messages. He sent another officer very slowly to the top to try and take command from Thornycroft, who's not the original commander. The original commander gets shot clean through the head early in the battle. Sending somebody up to replace him. He's taking forever to reach the top of the summit because it's difficult and it's so hot. So he says, well, I need to send somebody fast and young. Who's available? Well, who's hanging around Warren's HQ? None other than a young Lieutenant Winston Churchill.
Yeah, I mean, Churchill is, of course, effectively a member of the South African Light Horse at this point. Famous for, it's a black ostrich feathers they have hanging in their hats.
Right now.
And yeah, I mean, Churchill, young Winston, being young Winston, is absolutely happy to barrel himself up that hill and try and get through to Thornycroft. And he is one of the people that gives us our very vivid accounts of what it's like on the top of that hill by the time he reaches there. And listeners, bear in mind, we're now talking somewhere between sort of 4 and 5 p.m. we're kind of heading towards here by the time Churchill gets up there. And he describes actually finding Thornycroft on that hill. And everyone seems to know where Thornycroft is. Even in this chaos, he's relatively easy to find. But he describes him, when he finds them, as he was sitting on the ground surrounded by the remnant of the regiment he had raised, who had fought like lions and followed him like dogs. And Churchill doesn't mean dogs in a derogatory sense there. He means in a loyal sense that they have fought almost not to the last man, but certainly to serious casualties. They've taken unbelievable casualties on this top here. And Thornycroft is tired, he's injured, does no idea what's happening below. All he knows is he's not received reinforcements. He's no idea whether he's winning or losing, but from his perspective, he feels like he's on the verge of a serious loss.
He does, and the Thornycroft is just exhausted. He's got nothing left. He's been fighting all day. He's been in that night assault as well. He's shattered, he's injured. All around him are dead and dying men, and one big problem he has is casualty evacuation. If you think it takes ages to get to the top or indeed back down when you're completely able-bodied. If you're wounded, you simply can't go. So there's lots of wounded men just a little bit back from the plateau, and many of these men are very badly wounded. They're desperate for water, which is in short supply. Can't get water carts up there as well. He's looking around him and he thinks, we cannot take another day of this. I've had no orders, no information. And although Churchill says, reinforcements are on the way, the Royal Artillery is going to bring some guns up and things, Thornycroft thinks, well, what use is it going to be? We're being shot to pieces. And so he makes the call, we're going to retreat. We're going to abandon the summit. It's the only option. And so as dusk falls, and this is perhaps the best conducted part of the battle beyond sheer courage, Thornycroft and his units fall back down the slope, and they actually do a very good job of evacuating a lot of the wounded as they go, which is quite an achievement given the men who are doing the evacuating are exhausted. They've been in intense action too, but only the really critically wounded get left behind. If you're too badly hurt, you simply can't be carried down the slope. You just get left for the Boers. Unfortunately, a lot of these guys will die in the night from their injuries. But he makes the call. He's coming down. And Winston Churchill says, it made sense, even though he tried to make him stop and stay, it made sense. Just a little anecdote about Winston Churchill's ostrich feather, and this might be a little bit of a post-war adding on, although one or two people who are on Spion Kop claim they see it, but Churchill is near the front line, he's kneeling, and he's discussing things with Thornycroft, and a bullet flies over and blows this ostrich feather clean out of Winston Churchill's hat, and he pauses, picks it up, puts it back in his hat. Another few centimetres or inches the other way, you've had a big hole in his head. Churchill talks about this himself. Later, a few veterans say, yes, I actually saw that happen. It may and may not, but it's the kind of thing that could have happened to Winston Churchill somehow. And it gives you also some idea about how many bullets are still flying across the summit, even at around dusk. It's still a very active combat zone. So Thornycroft retreats under cover of darkness. But he's not the only one who retreats, Gareth, and this is a sort of fascinating thing about this battle.
Yeah, this is the big tragedy of it, is how close the British come to actually winning this. They don't realise how close they are to winning this. Because, again, listeners, you've got to remember the disparity in forces and logistics that these two forces can bring to the battle. The Boers have been fighting all day. They're also actually starting to withdraw at this point as well, both planned and unplanned. Because, again, you've got to remember that this is a citizen army. This is an army that acts very independently. And one of the challenges on the Boer side is always keeping a force in the field if it feels like they're losing. And to many of the people on the ground here, it feels like they're losing. So the Boers have actually also started withdrawing from the Spion Kop at the same time as the British. But ultimately, the morning arrives and they send up scouts because they know they've got to carry on fighting. And they find that the Spion Kop is now free of British and they can retake it and they can hold it. But it's such a near-run thing. The reality is probably, and you always have to be very careful doing counterfactuals, there is a reasonable chance that if the British had held that position through the night, they had reinforced it, the Boers wouldn't have had the strength to push them off. And that's the thing. It ends up as a Boer victory that didn't necessarily need to be a victory. But I think it's fair to say that no one can really be blamed on the British side who was on Spion Kop for the fact that it wasn't pushed through and pushed home. They were acting on the information they have. Thornycroft withdrew in good faith. I challenge anyone to do differently in his position.
I think that's absolutely right, Gareth. And interestingly, the army agrees as well, because in the aftermath of this battle, in the aftermath of the defeat, inevitably there's a lot of soul searching, what's gone wrong. Warren wants to throw Thornycroft under the bus for retreating without orders. But the British Army says, no, Thornycroft fought like an absolute lion. He's badly injured. He's not getting any information. He made the right decision. And Thornycroft will carry on serving in the war, really for the duration. He'll recover from his injuries and come back into action. The same can't be said for Warren. He gets fired over this, gets sacked. He writes a book defending himself under the pen name Crusader, which is not a very good book. Pretty obscure, actually.
There's a copy of it on the shelf behind me somewhere. Yeah. I should dig it out for the extras.
I was going to say, it's not a good read, but it's more or less Warren whinging that he was badly treated. And he does actually have some, one or 2 points. He's very critical of Buller and things. But Warren gets sacked. Buller is not sacked, although he's in seriously criticised. And the battle sort of ends in such dismay and disarray for the British. And it's bloody as well, Gareth. The casualties are huge. The official casualties are 243 dead, 1,250 wounded, 150 missing or prisoners. But the latest research says it's about 2,200 total casualties based on modern research, studies of unit roles and things like this, which is heavy in a small area, because the Spion Kop is it's no more than sort of 3,000 yards across. It's a relatively small area, and the British are concentrated in just part of it. So a lot of casualties in a small area. And one thing that I think makes this battle so notorious is some journalists, possibly Boer, possibly German, there's some dispute about who takes the photos, but some journalists arrive on the battlefield either the day after, the morning after, or the day after that, and they take photos of the position. And these are really shocking photographs of dead and mutilated British troops lying in the trenches. And these are, of course, published, and it gets across the carnage of this. And for a Victorian audience not used to seeing British soldiers dead like this is really explosive stuff. Absolutely shocking photographs for the era. And they still have the power to sort of shock and move now. And the Boers haven't got away bloodlessly from this either. Bear in mind, listeners, the Boers are a much smaller army, all citizens, and they've suffered 68 dead and 267 wounded, which by Boer standards, that's a bloody battle. Remember, they just don't have that many men, and although in absolute terms, the British have suffered close to 10 times these casualties, in broad total war terminology, the British can afford those casualties. Can the Boers? Not quite in the same way. So it's a really bloody battle for both sides. So we're looking at somewhere in the region of about 2,500 casualties in a relatively small area. So it is the bloodiest battle of the Second Boer War. There'll be lots more battles to come. And it becomes this sort of emblem of the incompetence of British command at the time. How can this happen? How can all these troops be bundled together in this killing zone and then blasted to smithereens? And there's no hiding from it because of these photographs, which of course rocket around the world and are endlessly republished. Interestingly, they're censored in Britain. They're not published in Britain during the war, but it's possible for people to see them because they're published all over Europe. And so this is a battle that just cannot be escaped from, and it's such a bitter defeat as well.
And that almost leads us on to something we started with the show as, which is why there are cop ends at football clubs, not just in Britain, but elsewhere. There's a bunch in Holland, in the Netherlands, as you would expect, but also Strasbourg has one, PSG, Paris Saint-Germain has one, Liverpool have the most famous one, but actually none of those are the original. And I can say this as someone who wears the red and white of a different red and white to Liverpool, is actually the very first football club to have one is actually Arsenal, the London Football Club Arsenal. And they actually have their cop end back in about 1904. And it's not really surprising when we think about the context and everything you've just said, Spencer, about the impact this has on public consciousness, both in Britain and abroad. Because this is the Boer War is the first media war. It's the first war where we really start to get photos. There's actually video footage of the British Army advancing in the run-up to this battle for the first time, because there's a film crew out there. And it has this enormous impact on the public consciousness. And one of those big impacts is this is a battle where lots of men were crammed into a small space on a hill. And football stands are small spaces at this period often built on hills where lots of men stand. And Arsenal as a football club are very closely linked to Woolwich Arsenal, which is obviously exactly what it sounds like at the time. They're still based in South London at this point. And so their fans unofficially start referring to the slightly banked hill at their stadium as their Kop, the Kop end, in reference to this battle. And it's other clubs that then pick it up from there. It becomes a more general term that gets locked into the national consciousness. And that leads, doesn't it, to a few years later, Liverpool picking it up.
I do, and this becomes hugely popular across Great Britain for football stadiums. And the idea, of course, of a Kop, which just means a hill in Dutch, was it, or Afrikaans, it enters the English language as you can use it as a hill. You actually see that being used in military terminology, but of course, it's given its most famous part by its use in stadiums. And what's really interesting is the fact that it makes sense that the Kop is called so in Liverpool, because most of the casualties on Spion Kop will be men from Lancashire. This is the core of this. There are casualties from other parts, but it's overwhelmingly Lancashire that bears the brunt of this. And so it makes absolute sense that in 1906 the Kop is christened this, because it's not only a reference to how it looks, but it's this sort of acknowledgement of also the sacrifice of men of this area. Plenty of men from Liverpool perish atop Spion Kop. What I find is quite interesting is that it also appears in other grounds. So not too far from me, Birmingham City have a Kop end for a long time. And there's no Birmingham connection really with Spion Kop. But I think that might reference both a wider use of the word Kop in the English language at this time, and it might not refer specifically to Spion Kop, but just the fact that there are so many battles for different Kops over the course of the South African War. But for most people, I'm sure, if you're a football fan, a football follower, you're probably familiar. You may even think, why is it called a Kop? Where's that name come from? Well, Gareth, now you know.
Yeah, and I find that fascinating. We talked at the beginning how the Boer War is one of those almost forgotten conflicts for a lot of people. But the fact that it still has that legacy today, that it lives on in that memory. And as you say, the other battles in this period, on all of them, that language is influenced by the military as always. It was the very first episode we did on this podcast. It's a good example of that. It's that persistence of memory, of almost geographic memory, when human memory fails. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Spencer, to talk about this. As those watching on the video will know, and as we talked about at the top of the show, where can people find you, Spence?
So you can find me on the sister podcast, World War One, Not So Quiet on the Western Front. If you've enjoyed my voice, you can come and tune in with a wonderful co-host and our mutual friend, Dan Hill. Or you can find me online at my website, which is all one word, drspencerjones.co.uk. And that's got links to all my books, all my YouTube videos, whole host of other things, and it's also my contacts are there if you ever want to get in touch.
And before Spencer and I geek out for another 10 minutes for our bonus bit, I'll tell people how they can access that bonus bit. If you go to untitled-history.com, you will find our podcast website. You can join the rabbit hole. And the rabbit hole is our special area where you get bonus bits. You get me talking about moments of the books. You get ad-free podcasts. That's all available there. And what I'd also say is, if you've really enjoyed this podcast, please do leave a review on your app. You may think it's just nice to say to me, oh, I really enjoyed the podcast. I love it when you do. It's actually really, really beneficial to me if you tell someone else that you liked it. Because all of these podcast apps, they promote things to new users based on reviews. So if you can leave a review, take 2 seconds to do that. It's absolutely appreciated. Or send it to a friend. If you've enjoyed this episode, if you are unfortunate enough to have some Liverpool fans as friends, and I can say this as I know Spencer's a West Brom fan as much as I'm an Arsenal fan. If you're unfortunate enough to have some Liverpool fans who are friends, do send them this, because then they get to know how the Kop end got its name. You've been listening to the Untitled History Podcast, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, why not head over to our dedicated supporter page? There, for the cost of a cup of tea, you can decide which subjects we cover next, get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and join a community of like-minded people. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Spencer, we now have 10 minutes or so to geek out. What are the bits that we didn't cover, whether with this or the wider Boer War itself, that you just think it's are stuff that is worth talking about.
I suppose the big one, and I'm sure you'll probably get some comments on this, is that Mahatma Gandhi is here. He's a volunteer Indian stretcher bearer, which means you've got this fascinating concentration of people who become incredibly important later on in the story. Winston Churchill, Louis Botha, Mahatma Gandhi will all play huge roles in the future history of the British Empire for their respective nations. And that's fascinating. They're all concentrated in such a small area. I struggle to think of a British battle where you have such a concentration of people who are going to have such an outsized influence on world history. I've been lucky enough to visit Spion Kop multiple times.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the most evocative battlefields you can visit. But it does have this very, very moving feel because the memorial up there it's now maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The battlefield is a national battlefield for South Africa, which a lot of the Boer War battlefields aren't, but Spion Kop is. And the trench line is there because the British soldiers who had died, the Boers largely just shuffled them into the trench and buried them where they fell.
I do think when you see low casualty figures for the Boers, it is, as you say, very easy to think, oh, it doesn't sound like a lot. It's disproportionately impactful both in morale terms and just on the sheer level of population they have, and also on their logistics. I read a really good paper a little while back on this battle. It said one of the critical issues it had for the Boers was just it used up so much of their supply of available shells, of ammunition, that it really hampered them in the immediate aftermath in doing further operations. You have been listening to the extra bit on the Untitled History Podcast. If what you have heard there is a thing you want to hear more of, then I'm sorry it faded out, but what you will have to do is back us, and then you can find out more. So don't forget to back us at the untitled-history.com for more of what you've heard here and more extra episodes in future.